Welcome to Time Nexus, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the complete, definitive history of the rise and fall of ancient Greece. We're going to be unpacking a phenomenal story of ultimate creative destruction. We'll explore how a complete, devastating societal collapse actually paved the way for radical political breakthroughs, how brilliant innovations brought a civilization to its absolute zenith, and how that exact same dynamic eventually tore it all down. It's a wild ride, so let's just get right into it. Okay, here is our chronological roadmap for today. We are tracking over a millennium of history here. We'll start with the brutal Bronze Age collapse, move through the rise of the city-states in their Golden Age, cover the epic wars that define them, and finally, look at the enduring Hellenistic legacy they left behind. Section 1, From Ashes to City-States. So to really understand the towering heights of classical Greece, we actually have to start at rock bottom. And I mean absolute rock bottom. Back in the 12th century BCE, the incredibly powerful, highly centralized Mycenaean civilization just collapsed completely. It was likely a combination of coastal invaders and massive earthquakes, but the results were apocalyptic. The grand palaces burned to the ground. The very knowledge of writing was completely lost. Greece plunged into a grim, deeply impoverished dark age. By 1000 BCE, the population had plummeted to roughly 330,000 people. To put that in perspective, that is a fraction of the population of a modern mid-sized city spread out over an entire region. Life was a brutal Hobbesian struggle, poor, nasty, and short. But here is the fascinating twist. Because those strict top-down Bronze Age palace hierarchies were completely wiped off the map, the ceiling was essentially lifted. This horrific destruction cleared the slate, opening the door for entirely new, unprecedented forms of social and political organization to slowly emerge from the ashes. Now, as they started to rebuild, the physical landscape itself dictated the rebirth of this civilization. Just look at those towering, unforgiving mountains and the Aegean Sea dotted with over 1,000 individual islands. This geography naturally and severely fractured Greece. Unlike the massive, sprawling, centralized empires that were emerging over in Egypt or Mesopotamia on flat floodplains, the surviving Greeks were heavily separated from their neighbors by rough, hard-to-cross terrain. You couldn't just march a massive army across it easily. This geographical isolation forced them to form small, hyperlocal, and fiercely independent city-states, which we know as polis. Let's map out the sheer scale of the historical eras we're analyzing here, just to track this incredible, agonizingly slow recovery. From the utter devastation of the Mycenaean collapse around 1200 BCE, we move into the Archaic period around 800 BCE, which is when the population finally starts to really boom again. Think about that gap. More time actually passed between that societal collapse and the later rise of Alexander the Great than between Christopher Columbus arriving in the Americas and today. It's a staggering amount of time. Then, the timeline pushes into 480 BCE, kicking off the legendary classical period before the Hellenistic age officially begins in 323 BCE. Which brings us to Section 2, the Golden Age of Innovation. During the Archaic period, those dark, heavy clouds of the Iron Age finally started to lift. Trade networks revived, the alphabet was adopted and massively improved, and as these independent polises grew in size and wealth, two very distinct heavyweights emerged on the scene. On one side, you had Athens. They did something completely radical. They developed the world's first democracy, where free adult men actively voted on state affairs. And they transformed themselves into a massive naval powerhouse and a brilliant cultural hub. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you had Sparta. Sparta was a fiercely, almost obsessively militaristic society. They focused entirely on intense, set-piece land battles and the ruthless subjugation of their neighbors to sustain their elite warrior class. These completely differing approaches created a highly dynamic, albeit incredibly tense, ecosystem. But with democratic rights truly taking hold in places like Athens, a totally new approach to politics and civic life propelled the society to spectacular, unmatched heights. You had incredibly visionary leaders emerge, like Pericles. Pericles wasn't just a politician, he was a powerful statesman who deeply, fundamentally shaped the core of Athenian democracy, while simultaneously funding jaw-dropping, monumental architecture that still defines the skyline today. It was an era of profound, relentless discovery. You have philosophers like Socrates wandering the streets, questioning everything. You have his student Plato, who later literally founded his famous academy to teach complex math, biology, and astronomy. This unprecedented environment of free exchange and civic participation fueled an absolute explosion of innovation. But of course, all that wealth and prosperity attracted some very dangerous attention. Section 3. United against the Persian threat. These fiercely independent, constantly bickering Greek city-states were about to face an immense, existential external pressure. The mighty Persian Empire, an absolute behemoth of a superpower, launched massive coordinated invasions of the Greek mainland in 490 and again in 481 BCE. We are talking about fighting an empire that controlled nearly half the entire world's population. That was completely beyond the capability of any single Greek city-state. It forced an unprecedented, desperate coalition of 31 Greek city-states to pool their resources, and it required unbelievable sacrifice. We're talking about the legendary stand of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, buying crucial time with their lives. Through a combination of that kind of sheer, gritty land resistance and brilliant, decisive naval victories that ultimately crippled the enemy's massive supply lines, the Greeks did the impossible. They remarkably pushed the vast Persian army all the way back to Asia. Which leads us to a massive, critical question. With the great Persian menace defeated, could these fiercely independent Greek city-states actually share the peace? As we'll see, the very independence of the Polis was a dangerous double-edged sword. Yes, it drove incredible hyper-local innovation and pride, but it also bred deep, bitter rivalries. And with the Persian threat temporarily neutralized, the spotlight instantly turned back onto the rapidly growing power disparity between the two heavyweights, Athens and Sparta. Section 4. The Peloponnesian War's devastation. Sparta grew absolutely terrified of Athens' rapidly expanding naval empire and their booming economic power. And notice how this fear drastically, permanently evolved the nature of warfare itself. If you track the shift from the pre-Persian era to the Peloponnesian conflict, it's mind-blowing. Strategies escalated from small, localized, single-city disputes fought with local resources to a massive, league-wide world war. Traditional, honorable set-piece land battles were entirely replaced by brutal, grinding attrition, extensive naval blockades designed to starve populations, and lengthy, grueling sieges. And shockingly, to fund this multi-city war of attrition, Sparta actually turned to their old, sworn enemy, Persia, to secure the immense foreign capital needed to build a fleet capable of challenging the Athenian navy. It was a complete upending of the Greek world order. The resulting devastation was absolute. It was catastrophic. Athens suffered a horrific, devastating plague right at the very start of the war, tragically killing their leading visionary statesman, Pericles, and severely demoralizing the city. This brutal conflict dragged on for 27 agonizing years, completely disrupting and hollowing out Greek society from the inside. Ultimately, a critical, fatal mistake by Athenian leadership allowed the Spartan general to trap and completely destroy the main Athenian fleet on a beach at Agaspotomoi. Athens simply lacks the manpower, the ships, and the resources to rebuild. They were starved out and they unconditionally surrendered in 404 BCE, abruptly ending the most influential, dynamic empire of the classical age. Section 5. Alexander and Macedonian Conquest. The relentless infighting, the betrayals, and the sheer bone-deep exhaustion of the Peloponnesian War created a massive power vacuum in Greece. And a new, overlooked power in the north, Macedon, was watching very closely. King Philip II was a tactical genius, and he capitalized perfectly on the weakened city-states by introducing revolutionary, terrifying military innovations, most notably the deadly Sarissa phalanx, which was a dense infantry formation wielding massive, unwieldy 18-foot pikes that absolutely shredded traditional Greek formations. He unified the fractured Greek Polis by sheer force in 338 BCE. For the first time, a national consciousness was planted. Philip actually planned to take this united force and invade Persia, but he was suddenly, shockingly assassinated in 336 BCE before he could launch the campaign. This assassination left his grand ambitions and his incredibly lethal military machine to his young son, Alexander. And Alexander the Great took that machine and ran with it. He launched an unprecedented campaign, completely conquering the massive Persian Empire and relentlessly pushing his exhausted men forward to lead expeditions as far east as India before his own sudden, mysterious death in 323 BCE at just 32 years old. This massive, explosive wave of conquest sparked what we call the Hellenistic Age. This was an entirely new era where Greek culture, Greek power, and Greek influence were forcefully, permanently projected across the entire Mediterranean and the Near East. Section 6. The lasting Hellenistic legacy. Alexander died at the absolute height of his power, without a clear heir. Instantly, his sprawling, massive empire was carved up by his top, power-hungry generals, creating a series of new, competing Hellenistic kingdoms. But what actually happened to the Greek culture in the middle of all this warlord maneuvering? You see, these early Hellenistic kings acted like predatory despots, but the Greek city-states themselves were heavily fortified and still deeply, stubbornly democratic at their core. They were incredibly hard targets to truly subjugate. So a fascinating equilibrium was struck. The monarchs essentially allowed considerable functional independence to the city-states in exchange for loyalty and taxes. Even as the new superpower Rome eventually began expanding and militarily conquered Greece by 146 BCE, those Hellenistic rulers had already successfully preserved the democratic and cultural systems of the polis. And this brings up a profound historical realization. The perpetuation of this culture, long past the actual moment of their political fall, is exactly what made it functionally immortal. You see, the Hellenistic kings wanted to legitimize themselves, so they became massive, wealthy patrons of scholarship and the arts. In places like Alexandria, the famous museum and the legendary library were established with the literal goal of collecting and translating copies of all known Greek authors. Public building absolutely boomed across the Mediterranean, and Greek science, philosophy, and culture were carefully, meticulously codified. The Greeks were conquered politically and militarily, yes, but culturally, they completely, overwhelmingly conquered their conquerors. And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. After tracing this incredible millennium-long arc, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How do you see the DNA of the ancient polis in our modern societies today? Seriously, look around you. From the grand, columned architecture of our modern Capitol buildings, to the fact that the entire globe still gathers for the Olympics, to the very foundational concept of casting a democratic vote, the seeds of this ancient, incredible story of creative destruction are still blooming all around us thousands of years later. Thank you so much for exploring the definitive history of ancient Greece with me on Time Nexus, and keep your eyes open for that ancient DNA out in your world.